So immediately to my right here is Mr. Eric Clemens. Eric is the founding CEO and president of the Connecticut Center for Arts and Technology, better known as CONCAT, a nonprofit organization based on the model of Bill Strickland's National Center for Arts and Technology, dedicated to creating empowering arts-based educational environments for at-risk public school students, and training programs for under and unemployed adults. He has an extensive background in nonprofit management and organizational leadership. Just prior to joining CONCAT, Eric served as the executive director of LEAP, Leadership, Education, and Athletics in Partnership, providing academic and social enrichment programs to children and youth between the ages of 5 to 23. Is that right? Yes. As young as 5. That's amazing. That's amazing. To my left, Joe Brummer, trainer, mediator, speaker, and facilitator. He's been studying ahimsa, am I saying that right? Through mediation, nonviolent communication, and restorative practices for the last 10 years. As his personal response to being the survivor of 2 serious violent crimes. He has studied Kingian nonviolence with the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence in Providence, Rhode Island. Participated in the Teaching for Peace program at the International School for Jain Studies in Delhi, India, and completed the International Intensive Training with the International Center for Nonviolent Communication. Is there anything else I should add from this? Is that good? All right, I'm going to leave it at that. Bios are in your program. Please take a moment to take a look at those. I like to, I run these talkbacks. I run talkbacks for this show quite a bit, and usually when we do these talkbacks, we sort of start with a question to the audience. So I'm going to pose this question to the two of you. You've seen it earlier. You saw it, I think, earlier. Did you see it at the opening night? And Joe also, and you've seen it again today, this afternoon. The question that I always like to ask in these functions is sort of just how, now that the play is over, or now that after seeing the play, what do you think about? Like, what are you thinking about? What sort of ideas? What sort of images, impulses does the themes or the language of the play bring up for either of you?
Look at me. I think there's such a nice running theme, especially with Trey, about forgiveness. And from somebody that studies nonviolence is about, that's a huge piece of nonviolence, is forgiveness. And his ability to give, or to try to give Meryl a second chance, to sort of forgive Lena's, hovering helicopter parent routine. He has this sense of forgiveness that's admirable. It's an amazing theme that I think we need more of in the world.
Great, so the theme of forgiveness.
I think, hi everybody. I think that, for me, 2 things. One is I've lived this play, right? I had a brother who was murdered and was an innocent bystander. Secondly, and more, just as important, there's such a, Black boys have such a fragile life, very fragile. And the slightest mistake, very different from other folks, the slightest mistake ends them either in jail or dead. And even though there was a line, and you're right, Joe, there was a line of forgiveness and huge heart from Trey, I saw his life as very, very fragile. Very fragile. And that persists still today. That Black boys cannot make the slightest mistake. And if they do, it's costly. And I can't say that for any other gender or any other demographic other than Black boys. So that's what it reminds me of.
You work with a lot of young men at your organization. Do you see them reflected in the play?
Absolutely, absolutely. I work with a lot of young boys who I pray that they become young men. And there's one thing that is prevailing to me when working with young. They're all very, very smart, huge potential, and they dream. But they don't demonstrate a certain resilience, right? When something gets very hard, they check out. And I've been trying to figure this out. Actually, I'm talking with Commissioner of the Department of Social Services, Rod Brimby, about that. I talked to Dr. Comer about this too. And one thing he tells me, because I always wonder how I made it, right? Because I grew up very much like Trey, although, you know, I didn't have a big mom in the house, it was my mother. And I talked to Dr. Comer about this absence of resilience, this absence of really this grit of whatever the conditions are, I'm gonna go through them and I'm gonna make it because I have a dream of who I could be. And he said to me, Dr. Comer said to me, he said, everyone has that seed of resilience. Everyone has it. There's some people who check out, and there's some people who go in and that seed prospers. And he said, for the most part, people who are resilient, they have somebody close to them that they want to make proud. And so then I started thinking about who was on the trajectory, who was on the periphery of these young men, where there's no one there that they want to make proud. So more to come on that.
Yeah. I'm struck, Eric, I think, and pardon me for interpreting a little bit, but it seems to me a little bit like you're talking about the outside forces working on these young boys. That a lot of what contributes to the fragility of their lives has in part to do with outside forces.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna come to you, Joe, because I'm interested. I'm gonna do a ping pong back and forth. Please feel free to jump in and talk at any point along the way, dialogue, and then we'll eventually open up to conversation with you all. But in the sense that I think what you were talking about, which I'm also struck by, is the sort of the idea of interior forces, right? This idea of forgiveness and the role that forgiveness plays within this play, which I know is important to Kimber, the playwright, which I can talk to a little bit here in a moment. But that I think part of what she has said is that the outside forces are forces that many of us are familiar with, that these are the forces that, you know, when you hear that there is a play at Long Wharf Theater about the shooting of a young black man in Brownsville, Brooklyn, our brain immediately goes to those outside forces. We immediately go to, oh, it's one of those stories. And I think what we have found ourselves doing time and time again here at Long Wharf is saying, no, but it's not. Kimber has not set out specifically to write one of those stories. What she's trying to do is she's trying to actually reveal, right, the individuals behind that are part of, that are wrapped up in, that are engulfed by these outside forces. And in particular, I think for her, it's about putting a human face on what is often a statistic. And so to that question, I'm just going to ask you maybe to speak a little bit more about this idea of, like, do you find that is there a role for forgiveness in the conversation that Eric is sort of starting us down? It's a conversation that is like the beginning of something that is an infinite conversation. It's a deep well, and nothing that I expect to get through today. But maybe we can touch on it a little bit. But where does this idea of transformation, right, of a young man trying to transform himself, because I think that's a key too, is that Trey is trying to put his life back on I think, for lack of a better phrase, the right path.
Yeah. That's a big question.
Yeah.
I think somewhere there are these external things that we try so hard to bring to kids. And what we're not really doing with kids, especially, and because when I started doing a lot of this work, I was going into schools and I was working with kids and doing all this work with kids, and then I started to realize my very first training or event that I did when I came into Connecticut and to New Haven's sort of social service world, I was asked to do a workshop for kids on nonviolent communication. And they were all teenagers. We got them in this room, and they're all from opposing neighborhoods. I asked them for their names. No one would tell me their names because they didn't want the other kids in the room to know who they were. I spent 3 days with these guys. It was the hardest 3 days I can imagine because they didn't want to talk to each other. They didn't want to reveal who they were to each other. And after 3 days of spending this time with them and getting them to open up, playing games with marshmallows and spaghetti to make towers and all this fun stuff that we could do to get to know each other and trust each other. and teaching them that the best way to use nonviolence is to not do things to people or for them, but to do it with them. That the way to get things done isn't to power over people, it's to power with them. And after 3 days, they're starting to buy it. And then after that, the end came, and the adults came back in the room and started being that influence to them. And all I saw were the very first thing I saw was one of the kids joke with one of the adults, and the adults fire back with threats. You keep talking like that, we're gonna have a problem. I'm like, I just spent 3 days telling them not to do this. And then it was my realization moment that that outside influence also has to be, I can work with these kids all I want to teach them nonviolence, but if the adults around them can't model it, it's never going to be internalized. They're never going to buy into it and believe in it. If what's around them as adults keep modeling, we tell them one thing and then we do something different, and that's got to change. I don't know how to make that change, but that's got to change. And so from that point on, when I went into organizations to do work and to do nonviolence teaching, I won't work with your kids if I can't work with your adults. So in other words, if you want to hire me, no, you got to set up a training for the adults first, because I don't want to waste your money and my time.
Well, I think in the play, him writing the essay was a metaphor in a huge way, right? You know, trying to teach him the mechanics of writing, right? That's external, right? That's very technical. But him going deep into his heart, into his spirit, and coming up with an essay, that's where the magic is. And I think a lot of times, not parents, but adults are misdiagnosing these kids, especially these black boys, because we work on them and not with them, as Joe said. And what ends up happening is a lot of times we are working with young people, especially these black boys, and it's really more about the job than the work, right? We create frameworks and these really intellectual schematics to work with young people. You know, trauma is big business right now, right? And, you know, but when you look at it, historically, you know, black folks have been in trauma since Middle Passage. And now all of a sudden, trauma is big business, and we are creating frameworks to identify the trauma that young people in the hood are experiencing. And that's an external piece. We have to have the courage to forego some of our comfort in order to be and sit with folks who are suffering in their discomfort. And until we do that internally, nothing will ever change. Folks will always have jobs, but not do the work. Because you have to be uncomfortable with folks who are suffering. You have to. If not, then you are wasting your time, and you're actually messing it up more than you are actually thinking you're helping.
I think I want you to talk more about that.
Okay. I believe that in order to serve people, you gotta love them. In order to love them, you gotta know them. In order to know them, you have to be able to sit with them and really believe in the idea that suffering is redemptive. That although people are suffering, it won't last forever. Because not only do I know what you're suffering for, I'm going to help you come out of that. But I have to be uncomfortable in it or forego some of my comfort to sit with you in this and walk you through it. You know, and unless we're doing that, because that's a matter of the heart, right? You really got to love people you serve. If you don't, it becomes work.
I'll even take you one step further. Let's not learn to be, and I'll borrow this from the creator of nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg, who sadly passed away this past February. Marshall said that we need to learn to be able to enjoy each other's pain. And that sounds like an awkward statement when you first hear it. He wanted to be able to enjoy other people's pain, which meant he wanted to be able to give to them so deeply his presence that we actually enjoy giving to each other our presence during your pain. In other words, I want to enjoy giving you the gift of my presence and my compassion. I want to be there for you. And do I want to enjoy the fact that I can be there for you when you need me to be there? So it's not, I don't even know that it's just being uncomfortable with people's pain. We have to get to the point where we can be there and deal with it without trying to fix it for them, without trying to debate it with them, to just be present for what it is. Thich Nhat Hanh had a really amazing, if any of you got to see Thich Nhat Hanh on Oprah Winfrey's Super Soul Sunday, where he talked about deep, compassionate listening. And the ability to listen to people so deeply that you can, and be present so deeply that you can relieve their suffering. That it's not time to like fix them, it's not time to debate with them their wrong perceptions. It's just time to listen and reflect back, meeting people where they are and being present with them in their pain. And that kind of deep, compassionate listening, I think, is what nonviolent communication is about. It's what nonviolence is about. It's about being present to each other when it's not comfortable and learning how to make that actually enjoyable. Like, I want to enjoy giving you my love and my presence and my compassion without it being horrible. That's hard to do.
So this is going to perhaps sound like an obvious question, or that perhaps the answer might be obvious, but I'm going to encourage you not to be obvious in your answers to this. But in terms of this sort of this aversion to that pain, that discomfort, right? I think that's everywhere. That's clearly in us. That's clearly in our cultures, in our society. That there's a kind of blissful ignorance sometimes that they talk about. I know when Kimber was writing this play, again, what she was noting, and I think it's captured very beautifully in that opening monologue, right? Which is our tendency to want to take these tragedies and to turn them into a soundbite, right? Let it be just a little bit of something on the evening news, and then we're going to go on to the next story, and the next story, and the next story, like, you know, people pouring buckets of ice water on their heads, right? And you know, again, I know it's going to sound obvious, but where does that aversion come from? Like, on some level, we share communities. We share communities. Part of those communities are being challenged in ways that other parts of the communities are not. And somehow we're able to sort of separate ourselves from it. We're able to avert our eyes is maybe the best phrase that I have. And I'm going to ask this question, which is, for you, where does that come from? What are the origins of that?
I think, when I think of that question, my wife and I have 4 daughters. And there are certain things that I don't want to know, right? I just don't. Because it's as a father, right, in that context, it makes me feel uncomfortable. But I think it's having the wherewithal to be as humble as you possibly can, realizing that anything and everything you do, especially for people, is not about you. And if you given that context, if it's not about you, it shouldn't be as uncomfortable as we make it. I think also, in a big way, we have this aversion to talk about race, right? And from there, it just kind of, to me, that's the middle of the wheel, right? I know folks who are not African American, and all the work that they do is on behalf of African Americans, but they don't want to talk about race. I'll be very honest, I don't trust people who want to help black folks and don't want to talk about race. I don't. And so I think it's that. I think the more courage we express and demonstrate to talk about the hard stuff that we've been taught not to talk about, but to demonstrate in our being, we talk through our doing. That's it. It's having the courage to go there.
I think our societies too are moving in this scary direction where our own sort of interconnectedness is missing. And it's now, when I was growing up, I knew every single neighbor on my block. and a couple blocks away. I knew my community. And what was happening in your family was part of your community. Where now it's, don't let the neighbors know down. Or it's I don't even know my neighbors. When I first moved into my block, I was so happy that when I moved into this block where I'm living, where everybody knows everybody. Like, that's not typical of most neighborhoods anymore. We don't know our neighbors. In fact, we don't talk to people the way we used to. And so we don't have societies. It's now just about, it's the me thing. It's just about us. And so it's easy to turn a blind eye to what these stories you see in the newspaper. Because you know what? I don't know those people and it doesn't affect me. Now, where's the remote? And that's where we are. And that's not where I want us to be. I want us to be in the fact that say, when a 15-year-old kid in New Haven gets shot, that doesn't just affect his school and his neighbors. It affects us, all of us. And I don't think we see it. So it's easy to say, it's not my problem. It's so easy to say that because we have forgotten how interconnected we all are.
Is there something that a person could do to shift their gaze, to shift their perspective? A simple, is there, not to be reductive, but is there something that a person could do to change the way they change the way we listen to these stories, to change the way that we engage with them, that would make even a small difference?
If I knew the answer to that question, I could sell a lot of books.
Yeah.
When you say a person, what do you mean?
I don't know. Well, it's interesting, right? Because you started with a conversation about race, yeah. Right? I know that when Gordon and I were talking about this play, right, we were approaching this play from a number of different perspectives, but one of which was that it's no secret to anyone in this room that the average audience member at Longmore Theater is of a certain ethnicity, a certain skin color, a certain class, a certain part of
You mean they're all white?
Yeah, exactly.
Even
right?
you didn't want to say that.
No, I know. Well, no, because I think I'm trying to gauge your all's mind and what that answer is. Obviously, right? I think that's true of all theater. So I think one of the I think the act of courage on Kimber's part in writing this play. Let's keep in mind, I'm going to let you all know, Kimber Lee, in case you didn't see in the program, is herself Korean American, right? So she is also an outside perspective looking at this story, and there's many questions about sort of appropriation of story, like whose story is it to tell, how do we tell these stories? That's a whole giant box to be open. But yes, I'm happy. I'm certainly happy with that because I am a person of color as well as working on this staff, so it's something that I have noticed. I love you all. I love you all. But there's a choice that is being made to tell the story of this young man, right? In this community, which is a community, Brownsville, Brooklyn, I assume many of you know, but just in case, Brownsville, Brooklyn is often, it's often noted as one of the most sort of crime-ridden communities in New York City, regularly, year after year after year. It's an infamous sort of reputation. And when Kimber set out to write this play, what she was setting out to do was to acknowledge that, the individuals that were responsible for that reputation represent a small fraction of the individuals that actually call Brownsville home. And that for her, what she was interested in was sort of elevating, perhaps, those members of the Brownsville community who were really their primary objective in life was to raise a family, was to build a home, was to protect their children, to keep those four walls, to keep food on the table. That's what she was exploring with this play, acknowledging, of course, that violence was a kind of constant in this community. And I was reading somewhere, or I heard somewhere on the radio, right, this idea that all violence is a sort of broad statement, but all violence was a response to shame and an effort to restore self-esteem. So I'm going to drop that in here.
There's a drug.
There are two things that are really, really linked about all violence, because I've heard those all violence statements before, and I have one of my own. And I think that's true. All violence is, I won't say it, it links back to shame. There are a couple of responses that we have to shame. And I think it plays an important role in this conversation about race, too, is that some of our responses to shame are to either attack, and therefore basically punish other people, or we withdraw and run away, sometimes with our tail between our legs. And I often think that's sometimes how we respond to these things is from that shame. But the violence, I think, comes from that attack thing that we go through. It's fight or flight. We go into that fight or flight mode, and as soon as you go into fight, then it becomes punishment based. There's a great quote out there that says, all violence stems from people being tricked into believing that other people are the source of their pain and therefore deserve to be punished. That punishment is the root of all violence, which I actually, after studying violence and nonviolence for the last 15 years, that is my conclusion. Violence comes from punishment. It's every act of punishment, every act of violence you can see on the planet, I can trace back to somebody trying to make somebody pay for their perceived past wrongdoings. And this idea that any of us can actually know wrong from right is absurd. We're never going to have enough information in our lives to really, truly know what is truly wrong or truly all right. Because the world is not that cut and dry.
Well, I'm not that deep, so
Oh, but you are.
Yeah, no. I'm thinking that if you value your own life, right? That's why I don't like black people calling each other the N-word, right? Because if I call you the N-word, then I can easily kill you. If I call you by your name, it'd be a little more difficult to commit an act of violence against you. But I think, one, and I believe this to the core of who I am, you have to convince people that there is something greater than the conditions that they see every day. Because that brings value to their life. I can kill someone because I don't value myself, but if I don't value myself, I sure don't value the person I'm killing. But if I'm able to dream, right, and so this is not a technical fix, right? You can't fix this with a wrench and pliers, right? This is a matter of the heart. That if I know I'm loved, deeply loved, then there's value to my life. And if I believe, again, that the conditions of my life can be improved because I'm dreaming and because I'm loved, then it's very difficult to commit violence. It just is. So that's based on how you see it.
And I agree with all of that.
Yeah, okay, I'm processing. Do you find, so one of the things that the play attempts to do, I think when you talk about the N-word and you talk about this idea of creating community in a space where often some of these young individuals sort of reject that sense of connection of community, like that kind of obstacle, right? What is this idea, so I think of this idea of dehumanization, right? That punishment also similarly, right? Like part of what allows sort of, especially the greater punishments in history, right? There's been a kind of dehumanization of the enemy or the other, or however you want to put it, right? That we sort of, that we turn them into numbers, right? We turn them into statistics, we turn them into a kind of like a whole, a single organism, as opposed to, vast numbers of unique individuals. And again, that's sort of at the heart of Kimber's play. I know it's just an effort to humanize, an effort to give dimensionality, right, to a news story. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, but I think again, the person has to know that they are multidimensional.
Yeah. So it starts from within.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the conditions in which they live have to affirm the idea that they're multidimensional, right? Trey had a grandmother who stayed on him. I don't know about the cursing, right? That kind of bothered me about the play, because although young people curse, they curse a lot, there is no young person I know that curses with their grandmother. Not a black boy. So I mean, that may be the new thing now, right? Because grandmothers are younger these days, right? But Big Mama, like that, I thought about that, wrestled with that for the next day. Yeah. And so, but he knew that he was loved. He knew it. He knew that when it was all said and done, he can come home and he was good. Not all of our young, especially black boys, have that. And at some point, maybe we can get into the issue of truant fathers, black fathers, right? Which is a phenomenon that no one wants to talk about, right? We talk about discomfort. But I think that multidimensionality comes from within, because there are people who are holding you, affirming that idea that you can be anything that you want to be. And if you're not hearing that every day, you won't believe it, because you'll succumb to the conditions that you're in. Thank you.
Well, this actually might be the time to do it then, because I think one of the things we're talking about, at least in Harvard, is the idea of support systems, right? So what are the support systems that are available to these young black boys? And one of the questions that you bring up, of course, is this idea of the non-traditional family unit, right? That there's what we think of as a traditional, I don't want to say we, what is often considered a traditional family unit in this country, which is a sort of nuclear family, right? Mother, father, 2 children. That idea is a definition that I think is constantly changing and ever shifting. Do you want to talk about that then? So that is a presence in this play, the absence of the father, right? There are no sort of father figures present in this play anywhere. I'm going to open the door.
So I would pause first, because what ends up happening is the questions when we talk about that end up going to the black guy, right? And what ends up happening is I run the risk of objectifying myself. Mm-hmm. And now I have thoughts on it, but I would definitely want to hear other people's thoughts on it, and I'll add in.
Speaking of, we have up here Elizabeth Nearing. So she's going to be walking around with a microphone. Does anyone in the room have a thought about this? But also, we're going to start to open up a little bit to questions to you all as well. A question over here, or a thought?
I think another.
Let me get you the mic so that we can hear you, if that's all right.
I think another dimensionality here is the prejudice that's in this country. I mean, you talk about the young boys and black boys and what they have to face, what they have to deal with. I mean, we're hearing about more white policemen shooting black men, and it's mostly in the South. But that would seem to me to be insurmountable. I could see why they would give up and say, I can't deal with this anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you deal with prejudice?
I went to seminary, Harvard Seminary, and I had evening classes, and I lived in New Haven, and sometimes there would be construction on 95, which I might have to kind of go the detour and through, was it Newington and those places?
Uh-huh.
The Berlin Turnpike it was. And I stayed on the highway. I sat in the traffic because the last thing I wanted was to be stopped by the police somewhere in Newington at 10:30 at night. And I'm doing well, right? So there is a posture. I would say, I'll speak for myself as an African American male. There's a posture that I take on, right? Because I admittedly don't want to offend anyone, right? If I get into the elevator with, a white woman, right? I immediately don't want to look like I'm you know what I mean? And that's ingrained in me. That's real. Because the last thing I want is to be accused of something that I didn't do. And so that's a posture, an automatic response, if you will. It's sad as it is, but something I think about all the time. Thank you.
You started out by saying that you wondered why some of these young boys didn't persist. And isn't it because they cannot take a risk?
Yes.
I wondered what you thought about. I mean, if you can't, to be persistent, to fight for what your dream is, takes a risk.
Yeah. No, you're right. My director of programs, and I talk about this a lot, right? It's this metaphor of a young black boy at the plate with a bat, and he wants to hit the ball, but what he does is act like he really doesn't want to hit it, right? Because if he crouches down and really is wanting to hit the ball as it's pitched, and he doesn't, he failed. And black boys don't get the luxury of failing. They don't, in comparison.
How do we look at problem?
One sec, we'll just take this question right back and we'll come down to you next.
I think that fish stink from the head. And what I mean is that there's been an attitude in this country that stems from what we have as a Congress. And now there's a majority party who have a feeling that blacks don't count and poor people don't count and people who haven't got a chance should stay there. And everything is being done to take away programs for opportunity for people. And they send us a message that is perceived by the rest of the country as making it okay, I think, to do some of these terrible things that have been done to blacks. And as long as we have that kind of a political party that has so much power and is being powered by very powerful business people who have a lot of money, we're going to have one hell of a time making the kind of a change that is overdue and very justified. And I think we've got to start from that, as ugly as it is.
It's important to recognize, though, that in that thinking, we do have a political party that right now we want to sort of point our fingers at and play this almost a blame game. And the reality is all of our political parties are playing the same game. Some just play it with a more stealth motto. And I think in reality, we have to find the things that connect us and not the things that disconnect us. Not the things that polarize us into black, white, Republican, Democrat, but the stuff that actually brings us together as humans. That feeling of being interconnected is so important for us making the change we want to make. To find every opportunity that we can to stop separating ourselves into little boxes like Republican, Democrat, Independent, black, white, Asian. I think the more we keep focusing on what's separating us, the more we lose focus of the things that connect us. And that's, I think, where we're going to find the communities and the peace that we want.
I think for me, and the way I work, the way I come to work, and why I do the work that I do, and the thing I impress upon my staff all the time, whether black, white, Latino, whether rich, poor, it doesn't matter, that everyone has the fundamental right to live a life of dignity, right? And that doesn't matter, that's not a class issue, right? That's not a race issue. To live a life of dignity. You may be poor, but at least you are dignified in that living. And until we treat people with that mantra, then we'll always be separated. We always will be. That is the prevailing kind of connective tissue, is dignity. So, thank you.
I think both of those points are extremely
well taken, and I agree. But of course, you remember Willie Sutton when the judge asked him, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. So let's parallel this when we're talking about drugs, predominantly in the black community. Whether or not this is true today, I'm not sure. But if a man is in a situation, a young man, where he has no hope, he may very well turn to drugs, to peddling drugs. So how do we look at a situation like that? This really has nothing to do with his family. It has to do with his own self-worth.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I just want to jump in statistically, because it's something that it's a stereotype that we paint, but statistically, the vast majority of our big drug problems are white people. They're not black people. That, you know, that vision that we have, whether it's promoted by our televisions or our media, quite frankly, go to Rhode Island where they're having huge heroin overdoses. There are very few black people dying. It's white people. So I think some of that stuff does happen in urban settings, and it's easy for us to, and again, we focus in on the story blips that we get from our news that may not accurately reflect our communities. So knowing our community, I think that's when you know your community, and you're in your community, you get to learn that picture that you learned about them isn't actually accurate. And when I started doing this work and going into places, I'm a short, white, gay guy coming into urban neighborhoods. I was very scared when I got here and to do this work. When my first offering was to, you know, back in 2010, when our New Haven's murder rate was fairly high, I was asked if I would go do a workshop in Newhallville at night. I was like, I don't want to do that. Now it's a couple years later, I'm less scared. In fact, I'm not really scared at all. I was terrified then. And you know why? I believed a bunch of stereotypes. And then when I got there and hung out with people and got to know the community and feel comfortable in that community, I saw it as a community with problems, like every other community. But the people, they were awesome. I was like, I need to hang out here more. These people are awesome, and they have good food. And we have to get rid of these pictures we paint of ourselves to find out who we really are. Not who that little box in your, anymore, it's not even a box, that, you know, screen in your living room is telling you something that isn't true about your community. Because you're only focusing in on what that news story, you get one fuzzy news story at the end. And before we go, fluffy bunnies at the White House. Like, we have to, you know, we constantly see this barrage of negative images of our communities that don't let us see the positive images, because those positive fluffy things don't sell ratings on the news shows.
Also, yes. You know, I grew up very poor in the projects, and there was always a prevailing temptation to sell drugs. I didn't sell drugs not because I was smart. I was scared. I was scared to death. You had to hold a gun. It was just not the type of thing that I knew. I wasn't that type of person. But I do understand that those who choose to sell drugs, right, there's a lineage of that. Because they have to eat. They have to eat. No, they don't go to, some folks don't go to school because they're hungry and there's no food in the school. So I'd rather sit out here and sell some packages for some folks and have some money so I can pay some bills and we can have food. And so I understand that is a constant temptation, especially for black boys. And when I say there's a lineage, right, I know a lot of young black boys who I work with whose fathers aren't around because they're in jail for doing the same thing. And now the boy is coming of age, right, and they're cute until their voices change. Then when their voices get deep, they become threatening. And they don't know that. They have no idea. But they're being seen differently now. And they don't have a father to guide them through this peculiar time of their life. And that's a reality.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
I'm going back a little to the beginning of what this thing's about. And it's there was a show called The American Dilemma. And in it, it showed, and through various terms,
Can you hold the
that the
microphone a
black,
little closer?
that the black, is it better?
Yeah.
That the black was brainwashed in America to feel inferior. And when they performed studies with white dogs and black dogs, they gave dogs for black kids, the black kids refused the white dogs as being more preferred. And I think the basic thing of this whole thing, in order to straighten this out, is for the white person to finally accept the fact that we are responsible totally for the black skills and that we have to do something.
Wow. Wow.
Okay, there's one all the way over here. I'll run around.
I do agree with that. I sometimes wonder how I didn't succumb to that. Because everything around me spoke to the idea of inferiority. Everything around me. And for some reason, I cut through it.
Did you have a strong family? Whether your father or grandmother?
I did. I did.
I have a question. In view of the leadership in Washington, has the presence of a black president, a black attorney general, a black secretary of labor, of Valerie Jarrett, and so many other prominent blacks in that aspect of government, has that had much of an impact on the black community in terms of the problems that is endured? I know the president's tried with several, programs that he started. Have they taken root or had an effect?
I think for me, it has had a profound effect on the possibilities of my life. I think when you think about class and folks who are struggling and suffering in poverty, it doesn't mean as much because they're not as close to it. Because actually it means even less because they're still struggling while there's a black president. And so I think there's a proximity issue, right, in terms of class that's at play here. I think it's an incredible symbol of the possibilities of one's life if you have the luxury to pay attention to it.
There's back here.
There's a back here and then a question down here afterwards. Yes, sir.
I grew up in New Haven during the 1940s and the 1950s and the early 60s. During the 1940s and 1950s, we did not have the mindset to kill each other. None of the teenagers got killed, not one. Anyone here that's older than I am, I'm 74, I don't know if anybody else here as African American grew up, the time I grew up with, there was not one killing. There happened one in 1956 or something like that, 57, but that was an accident. No teenagers got killed in New Haven. That was not the mindset. Now, then when I went into service, I saw it, I went to Scotland in 1959, and I saw all the violence, they had the gangs there. Why? There's a lot of poverty in Scotland. When I was growing up in New Haven, we had money. We were too busy making money. All of us made money. We were poor, but before a lot of the automation, we used to set pins in the bowling alley. We used to help the rag man, the ice man, the oil man. You know, we shine shoes. Had to go out to the city hall to get your license, to get your stencil and to shine shoes. We did so much work. We made money. You know, I used to make back then in the early 50s. I was making like $90 a week. Now that's a lot of money. Some people pay the rent for like $50, $60 a month. I was making $90 a week because you got $30 for 2 hours setting for a league. So what I'm saying is that a lot of this is economics. So then in the 90s, this happened, was exploded throughout the whole country with the drugs. And the absence of the ability for the teenagers to earn money, then it's in the nature of a male to want to have money, to want to be a provider, to want to feel like he's worth something. So some of the young people now, with the advent of the absent fathers as a result of the drugs, result of the crime, exposure to crime, not just New Haven, but throughout the country, and many of them make their money selling their drugs to the Caucasians that come in from the other areas. This is down south, New York, you know. So anyway, economics played a serious role, and it is playing a big role. And that's the same thing that happened in LA with the Crips, because people look at Bloods and Crips, but when you look at the real story, they had all this economic activity there with the automobile, just like in Detroit, they had the car makers and the lot of industry there that left. So after the second generation of people leaving, now people look at Bloods and Crips, but not knowing that was economics.
I was here listening, and I was making notes on a few of the things. I work in the institution, the Garner Correction Institution. I see the results of what we are talking about right now coming in there. And Garner is considered a mental institution for the criminally insane. So you see a lot of the damage after it has been done. And lately, I've been watching the families of those who suffer behind the loss of love in the family. The fatherless and the non-thinking, non-being able to think, to be human, to have this common denominator of father's love out of the family is gone. And of course, incidentally, the direction for the child's life as it grows without love, it has no respect for love for anybody, as you said. So this hardness comes about. His heart has gotten hard, and it's a callous mentality. They don't care about life. One young man told me something at MYI, the Manson Youth Institution, that has struck me so hard, and he stopped me in my tracks. We were talking about, I asked about 16 of the people who came down for the class, would anybody in here kill someone for $10,000? Out of 16 people, 13 hands went up. And one of the guys' hands that went up after it was over, he said, you know, he came up after the class was over, he said, what if you get a thrill to see somebody dying? I said, what did you say? He said, what if you get a thrill to see somebody dying? But before that, I went all the way down to $500, and they would do that too. But this is a big problem in the separation of family and thinking someone is growing up normal in the house and they're not. And we have this vacuum that society is playing it doesn't exist. But there's a big vacuum. And the father is mainly the one that can fill it, but he's not there because he's in jail or dead. So how do you get to it? We must save society with our common sense and stop playing with it as if it don't exist. There's much more. I made some notes that I can't even fill a page up. But
it's a sense that everything's interconnected, right? That policies lead to community disenfranchisement, which leads to, which affects the security and the foundation of the family unit, which affects the way young people are raised. That it's sort of, and it's a kind of, it's pervasive, right? And it stretches across all circles of community, all circles of society. Question. And the microphone.
I almost don't need one.
No, you do for the camera.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, first of all, for stirring up my brain cells and really examining a lot of things that I'm not always comfortable with examining. I have to disagree on some level. I raised my children in poverty because that was the choice. Not the choice, that was the circumstance. I chose to be accountable, I chose to be dependable, and I chose to have spiritual values. If a father isn't there, a mother steps in, community can step in. You talked about a lot of different issues that have to be brought in, but this feeling that I'm entitled to something has always driven me crazy. You're not entitled to anything. You can earn it, you can work for it, you can step up, but oh, they should pay me because I didn't do well in school. Well, no, you should sit your butt down and start learning. You need to own your stuff, choose it, and then become accountable to that, in my mind. And I don't think that's a black or white issue. It can be not even a poor or a rich issue. It is a person who does not feel that they are entitled. And then when you bring in the ease of drugs, when you bring in so many different dysfunctions, where do you start? How do you start? It's very, you say, well, hug your kids more, love your kids more, show them accountability. It's not just a black man thing. It's in my estimation, and I may be very narrow-minded in that. But my sons had choices, and dealing with drugs was certainly available. They certainly had choices to go one way or the other. They were more afraid of me than they were afraid of the consequences of selling drugs. Not because I would hurt them, but because they would disappoint me. I loved them so much, they did not want to disappoint me. That doesn't mean any of us are above things. I'm sure that for 2 or 3 things that I did right, there's another million I did wrong. But as long as we have this mentality that some of us are entitled. Oh, I had a tough life. I'm entitled to drink. I've had a tough life. I'm entitled to take this. I don't have to work hard. No, everybody else works hard. I'm entitled. When we become entitled, in my mind, I think that's a real sickness that invades us. And I don't often see that as an ingredient for accountability. There's a lot of different things we need to do to support each other and raise each other up. Spirituality, values, I don't know. You guys are fabulous, thank you.
I spent 3.5 weeks this summer in India. And when I got back from India, this incredibly karmic place to be, and I went there to study Gandhi. And when I came back, people kept asking me, what's the biggest difference that you saw between living here in America and in the West and being in the East? And that is my answer. That in India, even for what are called the untouchables, the poorest of poor, people who are basically, struggling just to find today's meal, there's this sense that life is a gift, that being alive is this beautiful gift that they've been given. We're here, being alive, there is a sense of entitlement. Like we're entitled to be alive versus we have the privilege of being alive. And that was the one thing that so when I got home from India, where people beat their horns at each other in this feverish fashion, there's constantly horns going, but it's never like, tell somebody you're pissed, or to say, get out of my way, this is my lane, I'm entitled to you. It was just this sort of like, hey, you need to move over. It was this weird thing. And then when I got back here, the very first thing I saw when I got back to the States, and I was coming home from the airport where people cutting each other off, flipping each other off, all this crap, I was like, I didn't see any of that when I was over there. That's not to say India has major problems with how it treats women, but this general sense of life is a privilege feeling that I found there is why I think people find India so spiritual. And then I come back here, and everybody thinks they're entitled to have everything. And I totally get that.
I think I love conversations like this because it gives me another perspective. And what I'm not saying is that there isn't a level of accountability, right, for folks who are living in urban communities. But also what I'm saying is, when I talk about people believing in the idea of something greater beyond the conditions that they see, it is very easy, and I'll be very honest and transparent, very easy for a white person to say what you just said, which is fine. I agree with you somewhat. When you're not experiencing what a black person is experiencing on a daily basis. You're just not. And it's something hard for me to I can't put it in words, right? What I deal with on a daily basis, being the only one in the conference rooms, right? And so it becomes that too, right? Even at a CEO level, there are things that are said and done, and so you're right. There is no entitlement, but I think having this type of conversation is where it is, right? That's what we need, because I would want you to sit with me to know what it is to be a black man here.
The microphone is in the back there.
I'd just like to just second what you just said, and just walk a mile in my shoes. I think you speak of entitlement, and I think I have the right to the pursuit of happiness. But because of racism, for myself, for my children, for my non-grandchildren, I worry every day. Can I even walk down the street? Because I'm not so agreeable when an officer isn't so nice to me. And trust me, it's just not easy to walk down the streets today, and it's not all a black male. I think the young men there said, it's part of our responsibility as, this came upon us. It's not something that we asked for. But, one time someone told me, oh, you're playing the race card. It's the only hand I have right now. It's what was given to me. I thank God that I'm a black person, and I don't think that it should be so hard for anybody to be in this world. So a sense of entitlement, no. A right to the pursuit of happiness, I believe I have that. And I don't think I get it. That's my daughter. This is my great nephew. I worry about all of my black people because it's really, really rough out here. It's hard to even breathe. To see the things that we see on TV, my God, my God, my God. I can't believe it's 2015.
Would you like to, please, the microphone behind you. I do need to, I am just going to offer, we are just getting started. It feels like we're now just getting started. But we only have 60 minutes. So let me, please, go ahead. And then I think I need to bring us to kind of some closing remarks, if that's okay. But yes.
So a couple of things. What you said was absolutely truthful and beautiful, but it's also very hurtful as well. And the woman with her comment, I really want to applaud you for being brave enough to share what is truly on your mind, because that's how we have this conversation. And I don't know if I'm going to say anything that's really prolific or like mind-blowing, but I have a son who's 21 years old. And he's in college right now. He's doing wonderful. My fears, though, for him may be a little bit different than sometimes the average or the majority of the people sitting here in the room. Some of you may still have some of the same fears. But the fact that my son wanted to go on spring break, I was horrified, not because I was afraid he was going to get drunk and fall out of a hotel and, do all those little silly things. I was horrified that somehow, inadvertently, and that's what many of us as African Americans, it's always that word inadvertently. That is the unfairness of it. Inadvertently, something would happen. I mean, I raised my son, all of us raised our kids very well. We spend the money, we send our children to school, and there are certain entitlements that we all deserve. He's entitled to be able to walk into an elevator and not have to think twice about the fact that he's 6'4", and he has a deep voice, but his skin color is different. He has the right to walk down with all the other kids during spring break and be silly, or to be a boy. Be a little boy. He's not a little boy anymore, but he was never really allowed to be that because there was always this fear that he's going to make someone uncomfortable, or someone is going to do something because he did something inadvertently. So we are all entitled to be able to have that pursuit of happiness and to be able to raise our children, like she said, if it's in poverty, where I can release my child and not have to worry about him doing something inadvertently. So that's when I saw this play and how beautiful it was. They told the story of him, but inadvertently he put his hands up. This kid was going to college. This is 2015, and it's great we're having these conversations, but they're very painful conversations, especially for us as parents.
I work with individuals that are returning home from incarceration. I run 3 programs in the state of Connecticut, men and women. And there is a component that is really, I don't say it's overlooked because, like Eric brought up, trauma is the big thing. We have a population of individuals that are returning that are in a lot of pain. And they are self-medicating, many of them. Some choose not to, but many are. And you know, for those fathers who have been absent, fathers and mothers who have been absent for a long time, it's not easy for them to come back into a household that really may or may not want to accept them. And there is a large population who are really trying to do differently, to daring to dream. There is an economy that is not accepting them. There are opportunities for employment that are not open to them. There are people that are just proud to be able to get their GED and work in McDonald's and feel dignity in that work. There are others, many, who are afraid of education, who are afraid to take the next step, many because they're middle-aged, 40s, 50s, 60s, and just can't get a grip. And so they fall victim to the trauma that they have encumbered for most of their life. And there's violence that is happening in the streets simply because people are in addiction. They can't get out of the circle. And so that does have to be embraced. Mental health and substance abuse have got to be a part of the solution. That piece is key. Incarceration is not where it's at. I'm glad to see that our governor is now supporting some options, to help people in treatment. Because a lot of the violence that's occurring on our streets is from people who are really not where they need to be in life with substance abuse and mental health supports.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna sort of try and bring this to a close. I'm gonna invite the two of you to respond to this. But just to bring it back to why we're all here today, which is of course a play. And in particular, I'm struck by this idea of narrative. I'm listening to you all. I'm listening to everyone here actually talk a little bit today about it in different ways. I think there are narratives that we tell ourselves, right? There are narratives that we tell ourselves about ourselves. There are narratives that we tell ourselves about other people. The idea that they're drug addicts or drug dealers, that's a narrative. That's part of a narrative, right? This idea that there's no possibility for you to go to college, that that where you are growing up defines who you are. That's on some level a narrative. That's something that somebody is telling us, and that we are choosing to or not to believe, right? And I'm struck by that, because I'm struck by, of course, finally the end of the play, which is that part of what is a central effort of that is this idea of a young man trying to change his narrative, trying to change the story that he is writing. And for better or worse, obviously, that life is taken too quickly. And that's part of a narrative too. But the heart of the play, the heart of Kimber's play, I believe, is the story of this young man, right, trying to imagine himself, right, better than he is, right? More than he could be, right? To imagine himself and his family fuller, complete, happy, right? And narratives are powerful things, right? They are fundamentally powerful things. That a narrative can affect the way we engage with somebody. Like, I can walk down a street in a certain neighborhood. I'm just gonna say me, because I'm not gonna even, and I can say that there is a narrative in my head if a large black man with a deep voice, right, comes up beside me. There is a narrative that plays out. And I can choose to listen to that narrative, or I can choose to fight that narrative. I can choose to reject that narrative, but there is a narrative. There's a narrative that has been built in us. That is, in part, right, this idea of brainwashing is a very profoundly difficult word for me, but, right, there are narratives constantly at play. Obama changed the narrative, right? Not completely, by any means, but something happened there that had never happened before, and suddenly the narrative changed. Whatever that means. So, I'm going to ask just the two of you to talk a bit about that, and then we're going to call it an afternoon.
So, at the core of who I am, I live by Dr. King's quote. He said, our generation will have to repent not only for the words and acts of the children of darkness, but also the fears and apathy of the children of light. That it is, the narrative is us, not sitting back, being fearful and apathetic to the extent that we continue to see people die, we continue to see people suffer, because we want to talk about it and maybe do something about it, kind of reach out, but not be uncomfortable in doing so. And so it is the fears and apathy of the children of light that will not allow this thing to change. We have to be courageous. That's the new narrative. The courage to be vulnerable. That's great.
I think I love the fact that at the end of this play, Trey says, you know, this is not the end of my story, it's the beginning. And I have to say, I have this nagging thing that bites at the back of my head that says, we've been having this narrative and these discussions for a long time, and nothing's changing in the way that I want it to. You know, there has been conversations about police-community relations, which I think is, you know, even the fact we're afraid, the fear of having a conversation about race it's community police relations. No, it's not black people and police relations. That's what we're really trying to change. And we keep having the same conversation, like cats chasing our tails. When the thing we have to start changing, we need to start talking, but we also need to start changing ourselves. And rewriting our own stories to be one that accepts ourselves for who we are, the good and the bad together, and realizes that we're all connected together through we all have the same basic human needs. And when we focus on those needs and see each other for our needs, you see each other as human and recognize the human in each of us. And that's, I so want to see the story change, because we could keep having these dialogues till we're blue in the face. But if we don't start changing who we are and how we exist in the world, it's kind of that Gandhi, I mean, of course I'm bringing Gandhi and love for him, but the whole idea of be the change you wish to see in the world, if you want a world where people are willing to talk, then you have to be willing to talk. If you want a world where people are willing to respect each other regardless of race, then you have to respect yourself regardless of your race. Like, we have to actually be this thing that we want to see. And I think, again, just stop talking about it and start being it, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure having you around tonight. It's just the beginning of the conversation, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for staying. We'll see you later.